Today we're going to be looking at what to do if you are in opposition for a change of motion and what strategic options are available to you. So there are 3 strategic options available to a team in opposition. The first is to deny the problem. The second is to accept that there is a problem, but say that proposition solution makes it worse. And the third is to accept that there is a problem and propose your own solution. I'm going to be breaking down each one of those strategic lines and what implications come with that. So let's start with denying the problem. Now, when you're denying a problem, you have to attack the problem part of the case that is provided by proposition. So as we dealt with in the video about problems and solutions, you're going to attack the kind of 4 levels that exist within a problem. So firstly, questioning, is it actually that bad that this thing exists within society? Is it a problem? Secondly, is it unique? You'd see this a lot with banning motions, where you might say that you want to ban recreational drugs and say, well, would you also ban smoking? Would you also ban alcohol? There are a number of circumstances where substances exist with similar effects that don't have similar solutions to the one that proposition is proposing. The third is that it's inherent. So if proposition decides to look at only the worst case scenarios, so say they characterize organized religion and they characterize it as incredibly dogmatic, very hierarchical, no room for subjectivity, no room for questioning or interpretation, that's probably a fairly extreme characterization of organized religion. Not every organized religion has this as a facet of it, and so understand whether those harms are inherent or not is something that you can also question. And associated with that, you can question whether or not you can legislate out or regulate out the most harmful aspects of something that exists and why you prefer to have that. So there you'd say that firstly, the number of cases that are that harmful are very, very limited. You can regulate those things out, and in doing so, you get the benefits of the rest of the spectrum of these things existing, which is of particular benefit. So that's how you break down the inherence of a harm. The last thing is about it being self-correcting in terms of trends. So here what you want to do is also look at trends and tipping points, but what you want to identify is either a positive trend or a positive tipping point. So when you identify a positive trend, that's to say there might be a problem now, but the trend is particularly valuable and we think it's improving, and we don't want to undermine the kind of positive organic growth that we're seeing by imposing an unnatural solution on the problem. If there's a positive tipping point, for example, then you would say, well, the game has changed. We are talking about a very outdated problem on proposition side. On opposition side, this game changer has meant that we can now pursue X, Y, Z, that we can now do different things and change the conversation for the better. So that's kind of how you'd attack the problem if you are saying that there isn't a problem. A good example of this is a motion like, this House would ban groups that seek to promote acceptance of obesity within society. And here you just have to question, is it actually bad to create acceptance of obesity? Does that inherently mean that more people will be obese? That more people will make damaging health choices? Because arguably acceptance is something that is beneficial, but also it's just something that people are deserving of. Like everyone in society, regardless of their choices, should have some degree of acceptance within a society. And the degree of sort of fat shaming that exists within our society and body shaming that exists within our society is really horrible. And it's a positive trend to fight that very extreme narrative that exists within a society that has its own harms associated. So that counterbalance existing can be particularly beneficial, and that's part of the way that you would attack the problem. Okay, the second option is to concede that there is a problem, but say that your solution makes the status quo much worse. So here, the section that you are attacking is the solution. And you can do this by using 3 different mechanisms. Firstly, and most commonly, you can attack whether or not the solution is matched to the problem identified by your proposition, or even the problem that is underlying, or the problem that is a bigger issue within society. So they might have identified a problem that matches their solution, but arguably what the solution tries to solve is a much deeper underlying problem. The root cause, as opposed to the symptom of it, can be a disparity as well as just the solution not matching the problem that people are trying to identify. The second is to attack the two tiers that you try and identify within a solution. So the first is that it's an illegitimate solution. You wouldn't do this because it is principally incoherent, because it is particularly harmful and morally repugnant to have this kind of solution implemented. And the second is that it is ineffective. Recognize that if you're going to attack the efficacy of a solution, there needs to be some kind of cost to it. So if you just say it's ineffective, but you've conceded the problem, then you don't want to stay at a neutral level. So you have to show why there's an active cost to imposing the solution. So there has to be an opportunity cost to pursuing the solution, or some kind of spin-off harm that is created if you're going to purely attack efficacy. So that's really important to note. If you just say something is ineffective, but you conceded that the way things are now is really bad, you have to show why that ineffective solution is going to make things worse rather than just stay the same. Okay, so a couple of examples of this would be this house would invade Yemen, where it's unlikely that people are going to say there just isn't a problem that is in existence in Yemen at the moment, but whether invasion matches what that problem is and where we are within that conflict and within that kind of humanitarian crisis is something that's very important to talk about. So you can run the risk of doing a lot more damage, especially in terms of invasion. Like, the spin-off consequences of invasion can be significantly worse than waiting it out or taking other measures. So this is an example of where you can either concede the problem, not advocate for a different solution, just say it would make it worse, or you can advocate for a counter-proposal, which we'll talk about in our third level. Another one would be, this house would allow neighborhoods in the US to vote to remove police protection. Now, it's likely that in a debate space, people are going to say that there is a problem with the nature of the responses between police and individuals within neighborhoods. So definitely certain communities feel far more anti-police than others. And if the police exist to create a sense of safety, to create a sense of belonging within your neighborhoods, and people now feel that in specific neighborhoods the police are actually the enemy, then it might make them feel safer to remove that altogether and to kind of do a reset of that relationship. And in that way, that might be positive. That might be something that proposition would say. But on opposition, you can say, well, yes, if people believe that police are the enemy in some way, you just add fuel to the fire, right? You say that we are safer with you completely removed from our society than with your protection, that you are not here to protect us, that you're here to attack us, that you're here to target us. And if the police is only governing certain areas within your state, you completely remove the monopoly of violence. You change that relationship of the police representing, those who keep law and order within a society. You say that they only keep law and order as a private army for certain neighborhoods. And so you make that friction and that tension and that perception of racialized violence much worse at the point at which you remove them from communities and change the relationship between sort of universalized protection and communities. So that's an example of where it could be said to become much worse on opposition. Okay, so the last thing I want to say about those two options is that you have to be aware that your comparative is between the solution that proposition is advocating for and the status quo. So in those two options, that's your comparative. In the third option, where you provide your own solution to the problem, you concede the problem, but you provide a counter-proposal, your comparative will be between proposition solution and your solution. So that's a really important distinction between the first and second option on opposition and the third option on opposition. When you are creating a counter-proposal, you are proposing your own solution. But it's really important here that that solution is distinct from the solution being proposed by your... The last thing I'd like to talk about is this idea of it being distinct and what you would fight. So recognize that if you're creating your own solution, you are conceding the problem and you are talking about the solution being different. The dissimilarity of the solution is literally the range that you're going to talk about in terms of the clash. So if you, for example, say in a motion about the poor being given an extra vote in national elections, if you say, well, no, our proposal is to give them 3 extra votes. So what you're doing there is conceding the problem, conceding the principle of the solution, and now you're just haggling over the margin by which you would make this change. So effectively, you're just talking about maybe efficacy or degrees of that solution, but you've conceded almost all of it, in which case propositions, ideas are likely to stand, and the debate just becomes about 1 extra vote versus 3 extra votes, which is a really boring debate to watch. So don't narrow the margins of a debate to the degree that you're just talking about like a tiny detail, because you're unlikely to win that. So that's an example of a bad counterprop where the scope is far too narrow. An example of a good counterprop would be, this House would make post-mortem organ donation compulsory. In that motion, as an opposition, you could say we would not make post-mortem organ donation compulsory, however we would have opt-outs rather than opt-in. So the status quo in South Africa today is that you have to sign up for organ donation. You have to also have told your family about it, so they have to consent to post-mortem organ donation too. So actually, post-mortem organ donation rates are incredibly low, and it's a major problem for us. So the comparative that you want to talk about is not the status quo where there is a very obvious problem and where the solution is not working, but one in which this method would allow people who have religious objections or personal beliefs that would prevent them from donating their organs post-mortem to opt out of that system, but still get the majority of the benefit, because most people don't actually have a huge principle problem with post-mortem organ donation. They just either don't sign up, or they haven't, told their families. Whatever the reasons are, there's a lot of silly reasons for people not being part of post-mortem organ donation, as opposed to meaningful ideological objections. And so you create the distinction between the two and force the debate onto those people with meaningful ideological objections. And so it's fine to concede that you would change other people's choices if they're not really making a choice, they just don't care that much. But if people are making a choice, they should have power and agency of their own bodies, even after death. And in that case, the debate is zoned in to that bone of contention, which is fine. It's actually valuable to the debate. So that's an example of a pretty good counter-proposal. The second aspect is that it has to be mutually exclusive. So you could have a policy that's just a subset of what proposition is advocating for, then you run the risk of someone going, yeah, sure, we'll do that as well. So you have to show why those things are mutually exclusive, and that's particularly important when you're advocating for something. The last thing I'd say is make sure that you're showing why their policy won't work, and then being very clear about what your policy is. So a counter-proposal should never come out later in the debate, where you assume that people know you're advocating for a completely different proposal, but you haven't actually said what that proposal is, what it looks like. So what you need to do right at the start, if you're opposition one, if you're running any of these lines, but especially if you're running a counter-prop, is to speak about what that counterprop is, what that line is, and be very clear about what comparative and strategic line you're running in the debate. It's just good debating practice anyway, but especially within a counterprop debate, it can get very messy if you're not sure that your opposition has chosen to propose their own solution until like the second or third speech, and can be very, very damaging. Those are the options as an opposition team. I hope that helps, and we'll see you next time.